Part 1. The Calculus Classroom Nopma. Karoline Leavitt was the kind of person who didn't draw much attention to herself. She was a freshman at a small liberal arts college, and like many others in her class, she was just trying to find her footing. Her quiet demeanor made her blend into the background, but there was something about her that set her apart, something no one really noticed. Karoline had always been passionate about math. Numbers weren't just symbols on a page for her. They were puzzles waiting to be solved, stories waiting to unfold. In her free time, she devoured books on advanced topics, exploring areas of mathematics most people never even heard of. But she kept this side of herself hidden, almost like a secret. The calculus classroom, though, wasn't exactly a place where secrets stayed buried for long. That's because Professor Harold Grayson ran his lectures like a battlefield. He was a towering man with a booming voice and an ego to match. His reputation preceded him. He was known for being brilliant, but also brutally harsh. Grayson loved challenging his students, especially those he thought weren't paying enough attention. If you zoned out during his lecture, you could count on him calling you out in front of everyone. It wasn't uncommon for students to leave his class feeling humiliated or defeated. One crisp Tuesday morning, the room buzzed with the usual pre-class chatter. Students shuffled papers, whispered to each other, and tried to avoid eye contact with Grayson, who stood at the front of the room organizing his notes. Karoline sat toward the middle, jotting down a few thoughts in her notebook. She wasn't distracted, far from it, but she wasn't raising her hand to answer every question either. To Grayson, that made her fair game. As he began explaining a tricky concept involving integrals, he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His eyes scanned the room before landing squarely on Karoline. "Miss Leavitt," he called out sharply, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. Every head turned in unison. "You seem unusually quiet today. Perhaps you'd care to demonstrate your understanding by solving this problem?" Without waiting for a response, he gestured toward the whiteboard, where a complicated equation loomed large. The class collectively held its breath. Some students exchanged nervous glances, while others leaned forward, eager to see how this would play out. Karoline hesitated for only a second before standing up. She didn't look angry or flustered, just calm. Clutching her notebook, she walked to the front of the room. Whispers erupted behind her. "Oh man, she's toast," someone muttered. Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, he's totally gonna embarrass her." Karoline ignored them all. When she reached the board, Grayson handed her the marker with a smug smile, clearly expecting her to stumble. But what happened next surprised everyone, including him. As Karoline studied the equation, her expression remained steady. She picked up the marker and started writing, her movements smooth and deliberate. Step by step, she broke the problem down, simplifying it piece by piece. The room grew quieter with each passing moment. Even Grayson, who had initially been leaning back with folded arms, straightened up slightly, watching intently. Within minutes, Karoline wrote the final solution and stepped back, turning to face the class. For a brief moment, there was complete silence. Then someone let out a low whistle. Another student whispered, "Whoa, did she just—" Grayson stared at the board, his brow furrowing. He hadn't expected this. Not at all. Part 2. The unexpected challenge. The silence in the classroom was thick, almost suffocating. Everyone stared at the board, then at Karoline, and finally back at Professor Grayson, waiting for him to say something. But Grayson didn't speak right away. His eyes darted between the equation on the board and Karoline, who stood there calmly, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. For a man who thrived on control and authority, this moment felt foreign, almost unsettling. He wasn't used to being surprised, especially not by someone as unassuming as Karoline. "Well," Grayson finally said, breaking the tension with a forced chuckle, "looks like we have an unexpected twist." His tone was light, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly, betraying his discomfort. He tried to brush it off, leaning casually against the edge of his desk. "Not bad, Miss Leavitt. Not bad. At all." But the class wasn't buying it. They could sense the shift in the air. the subtle crack in Grayson's armor. A few students exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. One brave soul raised their hand hesitantly. Professor," they asked, "can you explain how she did that, like step by step?" Grayson hesitated for a split second before nodding stiffly. "Of course," he said, stepping up to the board. As he began retracing Karoline's solution, his voice regained its usual confidence, though it lacked the sharp edge it often carried. He explained each step carefully, pointing out how she had simplified the complex integral into manageable parts. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like business as usual, just another professor guiding his students through a tough problem. But those who knew Grayson well noticed the absence of his trademark sarcasm. There were no snide remarks, no condescending comments. It was almost as if he were respecting her work. Karoline returned to her seat without saying a word, her face neutral, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the murmurs around her told a different story. People leaned over their desks, whispering excitedly. "How did she even do that?" one student whispered to another. "I've never seen anyone solve something that fast." Another chimed. "And seriously, what just happened?" A girl sitting next to Karoline turned to her, curiosity written all over her face. "You're like amazing," she blurted out, half joking but clearly impressed. Karoline smiled faintly, brushing off the compliment with a shrug. "It's just practice," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation, filling the room. For the rest of the class, Grayson avoided singling Karoline out again. Instead, he focused on explaining other concepts, though his delivery felt less animated than usual. Every now and then, he'd glance in her direction, as if trying to figure her out. Who was this girl? How had she managed to solve such a challenging problem so effortlessly? And why hadn't he seen it coming? When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the lecture, the room erupted into chatter. Students lingered longer than usual, buzzing about what had just unfolded. Some approached Karoline asking questions or offering congratulations. Others simply stared, unsure whether to be inspired or intimidated. Karoline handled it all gracefully, responding politely but keeping her answers vague. She didn't want to make a big deal out of what had happened. It was just math, after all. As the crowd thinned out, Grayson remained at the front of the room, organizing his papers. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched Karoline pack up her things. She moved methodically, sliding her notebook into her bag and adjusting the strap over her shoulder. Before she left, she glanced toward the front of the room, meeting his gaze briefly. There was no challenge in her expression, no hint of triumph. Just quiet acknowledgement. Grayson looked away first, feeling a strange pang of unease. He prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, the one everyone looked up to. Yet here was this freshman, a quiet, unassuming girl, who had somehow managed to outshine him in front of his own class. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was humbling. And humility wasn't something Harold Grayson was accustomed to feeling. As the classroom emptied, Grayson sat down heavily in his chair, staring at the board where Karoline's solution still lingered. He replayed the scene in his mind, dissecting every detail. What bothered him most wasn't that she had solved the problem. It was that she had done it so easily, so confidently. She hadn't hesitated or stumbled. She hadn't needed hints or corrections. She had simply walked up, written the answer, and walked away, leaving everyone, including him, in stunned silence. For the first time in years, Grayson found himself questioning his assumptions. Was he too quick to judge his students? Had he underestimated them, or worse, discouraged them from reaching their full potential? These thoughts swirled in his mind as he packed up his things, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. Outside the classroom, Karoline stepped into the hallway, blending seamlessly into the stream of students heading to their next classes. She didn't dwell on what had happened. To her, it was just another day, another problem solved. But little did she know, that single moment would set the stage for everything that came next. Part 3. Shockwaves in the lecture hall. The next day, word had spread like wildfire. By the time Karoline walked into calculus class, she could feel the weight of everyone's stares. Whispers rippled through the room as students craned their necks to get a better look at her. Some were curious, others skeptical, and a few even seemed a little envious. "Did you hear about what happened yesterday?" Someone murmured from the back row. Another voice chimed in. "Yeah, apparently she solved that insane integral Grayson. Threw at her, just like that." A low whistle followed. Karoline slid into her usual seat, trying to ignore the attention. She didn't want this kind of spotlight. Solving equations came naturally to her. It always had. But she'd never been one to seek recognition for it. Still, there was no denying that something had shifted. The atmosphere in the classroom felt charged, almost electric, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Professor Grayson entered the room moments later, his demeanor unreadable. He carried himself with the same authoritative stride as always, but his expression betrayed a flicker of unease. As he set his notes down on the desk, he scanned the room, his gaze lingering briefly on Karoline before moving on. For a moment, it seemed like he might address what had happened the day before, but instead he launched straight into the lesson without so much as a mention. "Today," he began, his voice steady and commanding, "we'll explore another advanced application of integrals." He scribbled an equation on the board, a new one, more intricate than the last. The class groaned collectively, but Grayson ignored them, turning to face the room with a smirk. "Who wants to take a crack at this?" No one raised their hand. The silence stretched out uncomfortably until Grayson's eyes landed once again on Karoline. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Since you're clearly comfortable with these concepts, perhaps you'd care to start us off?" The room erupted in hushed whispers. Everyone leaned forward, eager to see how Karoline would respond. Would she rise to the challenge again? Or would she shy away under the pressure? Without hesitation, Karoline stood up and made her way to the board. Her movements were calm, deliberate, as if she were completely unfazed by the scrutiny. Taking the marker from Grayson, she studied the equation for a moment before beginning to write. Once again, her solution unfolded step by step, each line flowing seamlessly into the next. The class watched in stunned silence, their pens frozen mid-note, their textbooks forgotten. When she finished, Karoline stepped back and turned to face the room. "Does anyone have questions?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the quiet. For a beat, no one spoke. Then hands shot up all over the room. Students peppered her with queries, some technical, others philosophical. How did she approach such complex problems? Did she use any special techniques? Was she secretly a math prodigy? Karoline answered each question patiently, explaining her thought process in simple terms anyone could follow. She wasn't boastful or condescending, just clear and concise. Watching her, it was hard not to be impressed. Even Grayson, who had resumed pacing near the front of the room, couldn't help but nod in approval every now and then. By the end of the class, the mood had changed entirely. Gone was the skepticism, replaced by genuine admiration. Students lingered after the bell rang, eager to talk to Karoline or ask for tips. Some even joked about forming a study group with her as the leader. Karoline smiled politely, thanking them for their enthusiasm, but she remained humble. "I'm just doing what I love," she said when someone called her a genius. "Anyone can do this if they put in the effort." Grayson, meanwhile, retreated to his desk, watching the scene unfold with mixed emotions. On one hand, he couldn't deny that Karoline was exceptional. Her ability to break down complex ideas and make them accessible was rare, even among seasoned mathematicians. On the other hand, her presence challenged everything he thought he knew about teaching. Was he too rigid? Too quick to dismiss students who didn't fit his mold of success? These questions gnawed at him as he packed up his things, his mind racing. As Karoline left the classroom, she noticed Grayson staring after her, his brow furrowed in thought. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should say something. But ultimately, she decided against it. Whatever was going on in his head, it wasn't her job to fix it. All she could do was keep showing up, keep learning, and hoped that others would follow her lead. Outside, the hallways buzzed with excitement. Word of Karoline's performance had spread beyond the calculus class, reaching students in other departments. Some joked about nominating her for a campus-wide award. Others speculated about whether she'd go on to win prestigious scholarships or publish groundbreaking research. Karoline tried to tune it all out, focusing instead on her next class. But deep down, she couldn't help feeling a spark of pride, not because of the praise, but because she'd inspired people. That was something worth holding on to. Back in the empty classroom, Grayson sat alone, staring at the board where Karoline's solution still remained. He reached for an eraser, pausing before wiping it clean. Something about those equations, the elegance, the precision, stayed with him long after the room fell silent. Part 4. A growing rivalry. As the weeks went by, Karoline's reputation only grew stronger. She wasn't just known as the girl who had stunned Professor Grayson. She was becoming a legend in her own right. Students from other classes started showing up to calculus lectures just to watch her solve problems. Some came out of curiosity, others for inspiration. It got to the point where Grayson would walk into the room and see unfamiliar faces scattered among his regular students. At first, he found it amusing. His class was finally getting the attention he always believed it deserved. But soon, that amusement turned into something else entirely. Grayson began to feel like he was losing control. For years, he had thrived on being the center of attention, the one everyone looked up to. He prided himself on being the smartest person in the room, the authority figure no one dared question. Yet here was Karoline, quietly stealing the spotlight without even trying. Every time she stepped up to the board, every time she answered a question with clarity and confidence, it felt like another blow to his ego. And the worst part? She didn't seem to notice or care. Instead of backing off, Grayson doubled down. During lectures, he started peppering her with increasingly difficult questions, pushing her limits in front of the entire class. One day, he presented a problem so complex that most students couldn't even understand what was being asked. "Miss Leavitt," he said with a tight smile, "since you appear to enjoy challenges, why don't you give this one a shot?" The room fell silent. Everyone leaned forward, holding their breath. This was more than just a math problem. It was a test of wills. Karoline hesitated for a fraction of a second before standing up and walking to the board. As she worked through the equation, her calm demeanor never wavered. Each step she took was precise, each calculation flawless. By the time she finished, the class erupted into applause. Not loud enough to disrupt the lecture, but enough to make Grayson's jaw clench. "Very impressive," he muttered under his breath, though his tone lacked sincerity. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like begrudging admiration, but those who knew him well could hear the edge of frustration beneath his words. He wasn't used to sharing the stage, let alone feeling overshadowed. What made things worse was how effortlessly Karoline handled the pressure. She never gloated or rubbed her success in anyone's face. Instead, she treated every challenge as an opportunity to learn, offering explanations that were both thorough and easy to follow. Her humility only fueled the growing admiration from her peers and deepened Grayson's resentment. Outside of class, rumors about their dynamic spread across campus. Some students joked about calling it the calculus showdown. Others speculated about whether Grayson was deliberately targeting Karoline or if it was all just a coincidence. Either way, people couldn't stop talking about them. Even professors from other departments caught wind of the story, dropping comments like, "Ah yes, Miss Leavitt, the student who gives Harold a run for his money." Despite the mounting tension, Karoline remained unfazed. She didn't see herself as part of some rivalry. To her, Grayson was still just her professor, a demanding one, sure, but also someone who clearly cared about teaching. If anything, she admired his passion for mathematics, even if his methods sometimes left something to be desired. What she didn't realize was that Grayson wasn't just testing her knowledge anymore. He was testing himself. Late one evening, after another grueling lecture, Grayson sat alone in his office, staring at a stack of papers he hadn't graded yet. His mind kept drifting back to Karoline, her steady hand on the marker, the way she broke down problems piece by piece until they seemed almost simple. There was no denying her talent, but it wasn't just her skill that bothered him. It was the way she carried herself, with quiet confidence, without arrogance or fear. That was something he hadn't expected. He sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. Was this really about Karoline, or was it about him? Had he become so fixated on maintaining his authority that he'd lost sight of what teaching was supposed to be about? These thoughts swirled in his head long after the building emptied out and the lights dimmed outside his window. Meanwhile, Karoline went about her routine as usual. After class, she joined a group of classmates at the library, helping them tackle homework problems. They marveled at how patient she was, how willing she was to explain things over and over until everyone understood. "You should teach this class," one of them joked, only half serious. Karoline laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm just here to learn, same as you guys." But learning wasn't always easy, not when your professor seemed determined to prove you weren't as good as everyone thought. Despite Grayson's constant challenges, Karoline refused to take it personally. She saw his behavior not as malice, but as insecurity. Somewhere deep down, she suspected that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't trying to humiliate her. Maybe he was trying to push her because he saw potential in her, even if he didn't know how to express it. One afternoon, after yet another intense session in class, Karoline decided to confront him. She waited until everyone had filed out of the room, then approached his desk. "Professor Grayson," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I hope you know I'm not trying to undermine you. I genuinely enjoy learning from you despite our dynamic." Grayson looked up, startled. He hadn't expected her to say anything, let alone call him out so directly. For a moment, he struggled to find the right words. "Miss Leavitt," he replied stiffly, "your abilities are impressive, but arrogance has no place in academia." Karoline raised an eyebrow, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "Arrogance?" she repeated. "Or confidence?" Her question hung in the air between them, unanswered. Grayson stared at her for a long moment before clearing his throat and turning back to his papers. "We'll discuss this another time," he said dismissively, though his tone lacked its usual sharpness. As Karoline walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Whether it was in Grayson or in herself, she wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. Whatever was happening between them, it wasn't over yet. Part 5. The Turning Point. The confrontation between Karoline and Professor Grayson lingered in the air long after their brief exchange. For days, neither of them mentioned it, but the tension in the classroom was palpable. Grayson seemed more subdued than usual, his sharp edges dulled just enough for people to notice. He still challenged Karoline during lectures, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, less combative, more measured. It wasn't outright respect, but it was progress. Karoline, on the other hand, didn't dwell on the moment. She continued, showing up to class with her usual quiet determination, solving problems with ease and helping classmates who struggled. But she couldn't ignore the change in Grayson's demeanor. His questions, though still difficult, no longer felt like personal attacks. Instead, they came across as genuine attempts to push her further, to see how far she could go. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling problem involving multivariable calculus, Grayson surprised everyone by making an announcement. "For our next session," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something resembling enthusiasm, "I'd like Miss Leavitt to co-present a theorem alongside me." The room erupted into murmurs. Students exchanged wide-eyed glances, some whispering excitedly while others looked downright shocked. Co-presenting with Professor Grayson? That was unheard of. Karoline blinked, caught off guard. She hadn't expected this. Not from him. Not after everything that had happened. "Are you sure?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Grayson nodded, his expression unreadable. "Absolutely," he replied. "Your insights have been invaluable, and I think the class would benefit from hearing your perspective." For a moment, the room fell silent. No one knew what to make of this sudden turn of events, not even Karoline. Was this some kind of trick? A test disguised as an olive branch? Or was Grayson finally acknowledging her talent without reservation? Whatever the case, Karoline accepted graciously, offering a small smile before sitting back down. When the day of the presentation arrived, the classroom buzzed with anticipation. Students packed in early, eager to see how this unlikely duo would work together. Even professors from other departments showed up, curious about the collaboration. Grayson stood at the front of the room, adjusting his tie nervously, a rare display of vulnerability. Beside him, Karoline waited patiently, her notebook open on the podium. "Today," Grayson began, his voice carrying its usual authority but softened by a hint of humility, "we'll explore a particularly intricate theorem, one that requires both precision and creativity to fully grasp." He gestured toward Karoline. "Miss Leavitt has kindly agreed to join me in breaking it down step by step. Together, we hope to make this concept accessible to everyone." As they dove into the material, the dynamic between them was electric. Grayson handled the theoretical framework, explaining the broader implications of the theorem with his trademark eloquence. Then, when it came time to tackle specific examples, Karoline took over. Her approach was different, more grounded, more practical. She translated Grayson's abstract ideas into relatable terms, using analogies and real-world applications to drive the point home. The combination worked beautifully. Students who had previously struggled to keep up found themselves nodding along, scribbling notes furiously. Questions flew back and forth, creating a lively discussion that turned what could have been a dry lecture into an engaging dialogue. By the end of the session, the room erupted into applause. Not just polite clapping, but genuine appreciation. Grayson glanced at Karoline, a flicker of pride crossing his face. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly teaching. Not just lecturing, but connecting. And Karoline, for all her modesty, couldn't help feeling a sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just about math anymore. It was about bridging gaps, finding common ground, and proving that two very different people could create something extraordinary together. After class, students swarmed around Karoline, congratulating her and asking for study tips. Others approached Grayson, thanking him for such an enlightening session. One brave soul even joked, "You guys should team up more often." Grayson chuckled, awkward once again, but this time it sounded genuine. Later that evening, as Karoline walked back to her dorm, she reflected on how much had changed since the beginning of the semester. What started as a clash of egos had evolved into something unexpected: mutual respect. And while she didn't expect Grayson to become her biggest cheerleader overnight, she could tell that something fundamental had shifted, for both of them. Back, in his office, Grayson sat alone, staring at the empty whiteboard where they had worked through the theorem earlier that day. He thought about how seamlessly Karoline had complemented his style, filling in gaps he hadn't even realized existed. Teaching had always been about control for him, about maintaining order and authority. But today, he'd learned something new. Sometimes letting go of control could lead to something far greater. For the first time in years, Grayson smiled, not smugly or sarcastically, but genuinely. Part 6. Redemption through collaboration. The collaboration between Karoline and Professor Grayson didn't stop at that one presentation. In fact, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for them, but for the entire class. Grayson began incorporating more interactive sessions into his lectures, encouraging students to work together in groups and share their thought processes. He even started assigning problems specifically designed to challenge everyone, not just Karoline. It was as if he'd realized that teaching wasn't about showcasing his own brilliance or proving a point. It was about helping others grow. Karoline played a big part in this transformation. She became something of an unofficial teaching assistant, always ready to step in when classmates were stuck. Whether it was explaining a tricky concept after class or breaking down a problem during group study sessions, she approached everything with patience and kindness. Her presence made the classroom feel less intimidating, more like a space where everyone could learn without fear of judgment. Grayson noticed the change too. The energy in the room shifted. Students who had once dreaded Calculus now looked forward to solving problems, knowing they wouldn't be ridiculed for making mistakes. Instead, they were encouraged to experiment, to think outside the box. Even those who struggled the most seemed more willing to participate, buoyed by the supportive atmosphere Karoline helped create. One day, toward the end of the semester, Grayson decided to take things a step further. During a lecture, he announced a special project, an open-ended math challenge that required creativity as much as technical skill. "This isn't about getting the right answer," he explained, pacing slowly in front of the class. "It's about exploring possibilities, thinking critically, and working together." Then, with a glance at Karoline, he added, "And yes, I'll be participating too." The room buzzed with excitement. Groups formed quickly, each tasked with tackling a unique aspect of the problem. Grayson joined one of the teams, rolling up his sleeves and diving into the work alongside his students. For many, it was the first time they'd seen him as anything other than an authority figure. Here was a man who laughed at his own missteps, who admitted when he didn't know something, and who genuinely seemed to enjoy learning alongside them. Karoline ended up leading her own group, guiding her teammates through complex calculations while keeping morale high. When disagreements arose, she listened carefully to everyone's ideas before offering suggestions. Her leadership style wasn't domineering, it was inclusive, making sure no one felt left out or unheard. By the time the project wrapped up, every team had produced impressive results, far exceeding Grayson's expectations. On the final day of presentations, the classroom was packed, not just with students, but with faculty members curious about what all the fuss was about. Each group took turns sharing their findings, using visual aids and real-world examples to bring their solutions to life. When it was Karoline's turn, she stepped up confidently, presenting her team's work with clarity and enthusiasm. "As ECO," she spoke. Grayson watched from the back of the room, nodding approvingly. There was pride in his eyes. Not the kind that comes from claiming credit, but the kind that comes from seeing someone else succeed. When the presentations concluded, the applause was thunderous. Grayson stood up, clapping along with everyone. Then, clearing his throat, he addressed the class. "I want to thank each and every one of you for your hard work this semester," he said, his voice steady but warm. "But I especially want to acknowledge Miss Leavitt." He paused, looking directly at her. "You've taught me as much as I've taught you, and for that, I'm deeply grateful." The room erupted into cheers. Some students whistled, others gave Karoline standing ovations. She blushed, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but also visibly moved. For someone who preferred staying under the radar, this level of recognition was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Afterward, as students filed out of the classroom, many stopped to congratulate Karoline personally. Some thanked her for helping them understand concepts they'd written off as impossible. Others simply expressed admiration for how gracefully she handled Grayson's challenges earlier in the semester. One girl hugged her tightly, saying, "You're the reason I didn't drop this class." Grayson lingered near the door, shaking hands and exchanging words with departing students. When it was Karoline's turn to leave, he stopped her gently. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his tone softer than usual, "you've reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. Thank you for that." Karoline smiled, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Thank you, Professor," she replied, sincerely, "for pushing me, and for believing in me even when you didn't realize it." As she walked away, Grayson stood there for a moment, watching her go. He felt lighter somehow, as though a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had finally lifted. Teaching had always been his passion, but somewhere along the line, he'd lost sight of what truly mattered: connection, growth, and shared discovery. Thanks to Karoline, he'd found his way back. By the end of the semester, the calculus classroom was unrecognizable from the tense, intimidating space it had once been. It had become a place of collaboration, curiosity, and mutual respect, a testament to the power of humility and perseverance. And while Karoline never sought the spotlight, her quiet strength and unwavering dedication left an indelible mark on everyone lucky enough to witness it. Part 7. Legacy of Growth. Years passed, and Karoline's life took her far beyond the walls of that small liberal arts college. She graduated at the top of her class, earning accolades not just for her academic achievements but also for her contributions to the campus community. Her peers still talked about how she had transformed their calculus experience, turning what could have been a dreaded course into something meaningful and even enjoyable. But for Karoline, those memories were just stepping stones on a much larger journey. After graduation, she pursued advanced studies in mathematics, diving deeper into areas most people never dared explore. Her work caught the attention of researchers and institutions around the world, leading to opportunities she had once only dreamed of. Yet despite her growing fame, Karoline remained grounded. She often credited her success to the lessons she learned during those early days in Professor Grayson's classroom, not just about math, but about resilience, humility, and the importance of lifting others up along the way. Meanwhile, back at the college, Grayson underwent a transformation of his own. The man who had once thrived on intimidation became known for fostering collaboration and encouraging curiosity. His lectures evolved into interactive discussions where students felt empowered to ask questions and share ideas. He stopped singling people out for humiliation and instead focused on building confidence, helping each student discover their unique strengths. It wasn't an overnight change. It took time, effort, and plenty of self-reflection, but it was real. One crisp autumn afternoon, years after Karoline had left campus, she received an invitation from the college. They wanted her to return as a guest lecturer, sharing her experiences and insights with current students. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't exactly her comfort zone, and she worried about living up to expectations. But something about the timing felt right, so she agreed. When the day arrived, Karoline walked into the familiar lecture hall, now filled with fresh faces eager to learn. Standing at the front of the room, she couldn't help but smile. So much had changed since she'd last stood there, yet so much remained the same. The chalkboards were still scuffed, the desks still slightly wobbly, and then there was Professor Grayson, sitting quietly near the back, watching her with a look of quiet pride. "Good morning," Karoline began, her voice steady but warm. "I'm not here to teach you anything new, at least, not directly. What I want to do is remind you of something important. Math isn't just about numbers or equations. It's about solving problems, thinking critically, and finding beauty in patterns. More importantly, it's about connection. Whether you're working alone or collaborating with others, every step you take brings you closer to understanding, not just the subject, but yourself." As she spoke, she shared stories from her career, weaving in lessons about perseverance, teamwork, and the joy of discovery. The students listened intently, hanging on her every word. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. For a moment, Karoline felt overwhelmed, not by nerves but by gratitude. She glanced toward the back of the room, meeting Grayson's gaze. Without saying a word, they exchanged a silent acknowledgement. Both of them had come so far since that fateful semester. Later, after the lecture ended, Grayson approached her. "You've grown into an incredible mathematician and person," he said, his tone sincere. "Watching you today reminded me why teaching is such a privilege." Karoline smiled, touched by his words. "And you've reminded me why learning," to which she replied, "Thank you for everything." They parted ways shortly after, each carrying a renewed sense of purpose. For Karoline, it was a reminder that no matter how far she traveled, her roots would always shape her path. For Grayson, it was proof that growth doesn't stop when you leave the classroom. It continues throughout your life, shaped by the people you meet and the challenges you face together. In the weeks that followed, stories about Karoline's visit spread across campus. Students talked about her lecture with admiration, inspired by her passion and humility. Professors discussed how Grayson had championed her return, proud of the role he'd played in nurturing her talent. Together, their legacy lived on, not just in the lessons they taught, but in the lives they touched. What started as a clash between two strong personalities had blossomed into something extraordinary. A partnership built on mutual respect, a classroom transformed by collaboration, and a story that proved even the unlikeliest connections can lead to profound growth. As Karoline boarded a train to head home, she looked out the window, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Wherever she went, she'd carry the lessons of that calculus classroom with her, a testament to the power of humility, perseverance, and the shared pursuit of knowledge.